Useless Monster by Mute Crows, Chapter 18, or Chapter 17. Izuku took a settling breath and closed his eyes as he felt around the room. There seemed to be nothing out of the usual, even if some of the usual was mildly distressing. The moment his arms loosened, Uraraka pulled away and bounced slightly in her normal flare.
Deku, you just vanished after that one villain teleported you! Where were you? Are you okay?
He blinked away his watery eyes and smiled. Of course, he was getting so attached already. A bitter part of him reared in the presence of kindness he was still discovering in his classmates.
I'm fine. They just wanted to monitor me in Recovery Girl's office because of the injuries I took with my quirk. It's all okay, though. Please don't worry.
Izuku looked past her over the rest of the class, breezing past the first question. He didn't see the way Ida and Nomuraka glanced at each other. What he did notice, but tried his best not to linger on, was the fact that Tsuyu was still quietly looking at her desk. He wanted to talk to her, but he wasn't going to push it. This wasn't exactly something he was going to force anybody to talk about, really, especially when no one seemed to get a chance to willingly sign up for it in the first place. Izuku would not blame her at all if she decided that the stunt he pulled at USJ was the line too far crossed. Overshot by countless meters. He could still clearly remember how afraid she was when he had changed. Ida broke from the group and quickly strode to the front of the room, calling in his personal brand of command for everyone to please go back to their seats. Izuku was more than happy to do so and slid his bag under his seat. As an afterthought, he cast around with his quirk past the nearby classrooms, seeing as their assumed substitute wasn't there yet. Then he felt the aches, the jarring pains, a splitting headache, an entirely sore body, a shooting pain down the left leg that had to be causing a significant limp, and buried under it all, burning eyes. He didn't even think to hesitate when he pulled enough of the collective pains away to at least take off the edge. He still felt weird without the stolen pains, and didn't want to push his luck with his quirk possibly triggering another shift. Not when he just got out of his unofficial lockup. It settled into his muscles and, oddly, his bones, as Ida rushed to sit in his seat moments before the bell. A sound that chimed on cue with the door sliding open to reveal Aizawa, wrapped in bandages but standing straight as he crossed the room. The pointed look Izuku got thrown his way at him, staring at his hands on the desk, skin prickling.
Morning, everyone. Glad to see you're all here.
Exhaustion was seeping from his voice as he glanced across the rest of the class as if checking that all the seats were truly filled. There was barely even a beat of stunned silence before the class burst into noise. Questions about if Aizawa should be up, how he was up after such a severe set of injuries, what he was doing here so soon, and a few cautious opinions on how he shouldn't be here at all. When he just sighed at the controlled chaos, the class quickly dropped the volley and listened attentively.
That's not important. It's my job to be here, and that's for me to worry about, not you lot. What you need to focus on is the soon-to-begin sports festival.
Excitement thrilled through a majority of the students. The chance of big-name recognition being under the spotlight for the nation at large to see was something any up-and-coming hero would strive for, and something Izuku has aimed to avoid for years. He knew he wasn't ready yet. He didn't know if he could be in the future either. He had some pretty big roadblocks he was still working through before he would be ready for that direct path, and he knew it. Yet he was still working on it. It was a start. Yagi said he just had to do his best, whatever it may be.
The school plans on following through with the festival on its normal schedule.
Isn't that something that is, super obvious as a target after USJ?
Kaminari asked with his hand raised slightly. Super obvious goes both ways, though. Obvious target means obvious defense increase, Jiro pointed out.
Indeed, police presence will be severely increased. Even today, there are officers on campus. The school seems confident there will be no issues and sees this as a chance to prove it has everything in line after the attack. Regardless, this is a very important opportunity for you all.
Aizawa cut in to stop the chatter from starting back up. So this is our chance to be recognized by scouting heroes, Momo said calmly from the back.
Your chances to get scouted and recognized are limited. 3 years? 3 chances. The festival is different every year so as to exemplify the growths of later years and the adaptability of first years. That will be all you get before you are on your own in the hero world at large. Getting picked up by a big name gets more spotlight time for you, a better chance at the big game, but also can leave you stuck. Use your brain. Don't miss your chances that arise.
He looked at the clock on the wall as he finished. The class started to debate possible festival games based off of the old events they had grown up seeing the moment he stepped away from the podium and towards the door. The festivals were something they all had been invested in as kids. Even Izuku had seen summaries and clips on the screens in the city. Everyone had a kid they rooted for. It was part of the energy it brought out of the crowds. A few students followed their teachers' movements out of their peripheral. Aizawa was leaving. An unusual event, even based off the few class periods they have had with their homeroom teacher. He paused by the door.
Midoriya, if you would come with me a moment.
Izuku froze in his seat as a few kids made some joking ooh noises. Aizawa was out of the room before they even finished, and Izuku hurried after him, closing the door gently behind. His slouched form stood patiently by a door a few rooms down. The door label read Quirk Diversity in neat characters.
The elective is after school, so don't worry about someone stopping by.
He slid the door open softly and stepped aside to let Izuku through first. Anxiety practically boiled his insides as he picked at his own hands and shuffled past. He hardly even heard the door shut behind them, which was probably an attempt to not scare him, but it made him even more nervous overall. Aizawa walked past and sat in one of the seats, sagging somewhat while his body seemed to radiate with resurfacing aches. His sigh cut off the moment Izuku started to grab at the aches again.
Stop that!
Izuku tensed, holding the pains in his grasp before gently letting it settle back. Reluctant.
You're my student, not my nurse. You need to focus on healing yourself. I was doing my job, and this is not anything new for me to—
I know! Izuku risked the interruption and looked up to finally meet his eyes. The understanding that Izuku had healed him numerous times in the past was unsaid. He sighed in response.
Apparently, I need to prepare better for the future.
The silence settled jaggedly. Izuku didn't know why he was called here. The possibility of it being a scolding or wave of accusation for their indirect shared history was steadily fading. He could only guess what Aizawa was doing or intended to talk about, but he hated the wait. It let his brain run too much.
Do you feel okay? Are you healthy?
Aizawa finally asked, stilted in his concerns. He was trying not to overstep any boundaries, it would seem.
I'm normal.
Izuku fidgeted through the words. His sides ached. He didn't mention it.
That does little to instill confidence in you having healed completely.
I heal faster than—
Aizawa let out a scoffing grumble, one that quickly cut short as Izuku flinched. He usually was good at subduing them, but it caught him off guard. A slip-up. Again. Stupid. Instead, Aizawa opted to press a casted hand gently against his own forehead.
You're missing the point, Midoriya.
His arm settled back down to rest in his lap.
The staff here at UA is intentionally filled with licensed heroes. You can pull up the full roster from the teachers to the cooks to the janitors. It is our job to keep you kids as safe as we can because, of course, the future hero generations would be possible targets. It's our job on 2 or more levels. It's not—
He took a breath that felt a little too full for Izuku's comfort. It was turning out to be an indirect scolding after all.
It's not your job to try and protect the heroes. It's not a stage for you to rip yourself apart repeatedly until you are barely able to move or breathe. You aren't fodder to buy time for another person.
Izuku stared at his hands where he stood.
You aren't a means to everyone else's end, Midoriya.
He was quiet, almost gentle, as he posed the concept to him. Something in Izuku's chest felt like it twisted hard. It hurt to hear what he so fundamentally couldn't bring himself to believe. It didn't fit anywhere in his puzzle of a patchworked mind.
I was made this way. My quirk is literally building me up to be broken. It's what I do.
Izuku tried to counter weakly. His entire genetic makeup pointed to the fact of how he was meant to break. He was supposed to break. That was the point. He broke so that others didn't have to. The aftermath was irrelevant.
Your quirk doesn't dictate your life course. Even I can tell you were smart enough to understand as much.
Aizawa looked at his bound arms a moment.
I will do my best to try and prevent you from having to face that amount of fear again while in my class. Especially when you should be working to better yourself with your education. I can make no promises. The job of a hero is dangerous and scary to many, and the ones who say nothing has startled or scared them on the job is lying. The world at large couldn't care less if promises are made or not, nor does it care about responsibilities taken. But that doesn't mean I will not try. I know that All Might is already trying. That's all that heroes can do.
Izuku fumbled mentally over what he was hearing. He didn't know where to put the sentiments shown and offers indirectly being made in his brain. There wasn't room. He couldn't have room where people would typically come and go before he really knew them at all. He couldn't have room to let himself grow warm with someone. Even with Yagi, it was difficult trying to keep a little distance when he so desperately wanted more of the kindness given. It was selfish, is what he would tell himself. That it was selfish to try and take the attention of anyone, let alone the world's most beloved hero. That a monster didn't deserve that kindness. But I'm not one. Apparently. He tried to counter his own thoughts. It was not very successful, but his heart sped up at the idea of some form of forgiveness he didn't know he was searching for.
But I messed up.
The bell marking the end of homeroom rang, the sudden sound causing him to jump. Aizawa gave him a moment before answering.
Your routine. That's practically part of your age description. You can't be a human or even a hero and not mess up.
I was a liability. I put everyone in danger by distracting them.
Izuku pointed out, trying to settle his heart, trying to reveal all these things that he did wrong. His reasons for his necessary discardment. His eyes burned.
Midoriya, that's where it becomes my job to help you and keep you as safe as I can while you learn. Where I will continue to help you and protect you so that you can continue to learn.
Don't lie. Please.
A tear escaped even as he fought them back. This felt like too much, but so little at the same time.
All my worst scars are made with them.
Aizawa looked at him, surprised. He didn't respond, but Izuku hazarded a glance and saw the confusion in his barely visible eyes. He couldn't keep digging into himself like this. He felt too exposed already. He needed a chance to pull up his defenses that were being slowly broken over the past year. So he redirected the topic.
Why did you spend so long looking for me, Aizawa-sensei? I know you were. I could feel your dry eyes close by on multiple occasions.
Izuku glanced again, watching the way his shoulders rose, then dropped in a long sigh and fumbled with his sleeve. I guess even he isn't too sure why. Aizawa couldn't help but feel a little surprised that Midoriya had him figured out the entire time. Sure, he knew the boy was much more clever than some of his classmates probably gave him credit for, but he didn't know that his quirk allowed him to learn people by chronic aches or pains alone. Still, he had a plan he came up with in bits and pieces in the medbay, and he would need to be on a level of honest straight talk if he was going to hope it would possibly work. He needed Midoriya to trust him. He needed to build that trust in a fraction of the time that All Might likely had to build it as well. Not to the same degree, obviously, as that level of trust was not able to be rushed with anyone. All Aizawa needed was enough to keep the kid alive. There was too much about Midoriya that was painfully familiar to him, and he knew how difficult it was to get out of such a place with friends. It had to be near impossible to do it alone. So, bold but gentle honesty it would be.
Do you want the long version or a good summary of it?
He asked, sitting up more so that he could turn and face Midoriya more.
The summary would take up less of your time.
Midoriya finally pulled the chair aside and sat quietly. Always quietly, minimizing his effects, minimizing himself.
All right. At first, I was under the idea that you had been a general street thug with a very unusual metamorphic quirk. One that escaped a street fight and was still out and available to get into another one. I was doing my job of bringing in the criminals that heroes don't typically concern themselves with, or at least the ones they aren't concerned too overtly with. It was probably the third or fourth time you had healed me without me even seeing you that I changed my plan. You pulled at my chronic aches and a small, barely even noticeable one in my lower back. Criminals don't tend to do that. Yet I never saw your other form. This form. I didn't even know that was a different form to begin with. I was reluctantly worried about searching for someone who was hurt and afraid. That's how you had been when I first saw you, after all. I was stumped on how you hid so effectively, even when you healed me during the day. I found forums online after searching for hours that dated back a handful of years that mentioned your form in passing. They always had varying details, but the generals were the same, and if you didn't travel when you were younger, you were practically an urban legend in many areas. I was determined to find you. I didn't have any specific driving reason, but it gave me things to do on my slower work days and patrols. It was a goal. I wanted to find you because you were so difficult to locate in the first place. Then you showed up at the exam and Mike told me about thugs he overheard. Students who had their injuries pulled away, all coming from only one test location. We located you in particular and I tapped you for my class. It was only logical to aim for you to be in my class if you were linked to my search.
He watched how Midoriya stayed with his eyes glued on his hands that picked at themselves with frantic energy. He saw the red smudges where he was picking away too much. Aizawa resigned himself to the prodding it would undoubtedly take to get any further words out of him.
Your mother isn't around anymore, is she?
Aizawa didn't feel the need to beat around the bush. It would only make Midoriya more anxious if he did, and there was no kind way to pose such a question. The kid froze.
The name Midoriya was familiar,
he said softly, looking away from Midoriya when he noticed a hand raised to wipe at tears. A weak offering of privacy.
Back when I first started doing hero work,
he continued,
I was set on working underground. My quirk wouldn't be as much of an advantage if everyone recognized me on sight. So I shadowed a lot of police stations in my first 2 or 3 years. A missing persons report went up for a brief time before getting pulled down. It was apparently presumed to be a dumb prank pulled by teens because of the age written on the report. I don't know why that stuck with me, but it did. The first occasions of strange things seemed to do that in general.
Midoriya was muttering softly as he listened, hands balling up his pant legs. It made Aizawa's gut turn uncomfortably as he considered how things must have played out for him. In every possible way, the systems put in place repeatedly failed this kid. Teachers didn't care for a non-flashy quirk. The cops failed to take his pleas seriously. Heroes don't exactly ask every kid they see on the street if they have a home. Time and people as a whole just passed Midoriya by without a glance back. The worst part is that Midoriya was doubtless not the only one to experience such failures. It was something heroes had to live with, knowing all the time. He watched as Midoriya started to close himself off, an act of self-defense.
Would you also include lies of omission into that statement of yours, with how lies lead to scars?
Aizawa left it open-ended. It was an attempt at extending a bridge. His student had the option of answering without saying anything or answering and trying to fill him in on things about himself. And to his partial surprise and relief, Midoriya opened up. He talked about his other form, calling himself a monster in a way that seeped with apathetic distaste from his tone. Distaste for his own person. The kind that was so deeply sown he probably didn't even realize it was there anymore. Dangerously embedded into his character. He talked about his lack of a home and his usual routines. That the monster form at USJ was not something he had known about, but he didn't elaborate much further on it. Aizawa didn't fault him for it or even consider pushing him about it. Midoriya was trying to be open, and he would take what he could get. The brief inclusion of how he had talked to the detective about his form was a bit unexpected, but the addition of how All Might mention them being close friends cleared it away quickly. It was a brief crash course, he assumed, just the basics to keep him above the waterline. Although, in the whole information dump, there was a question Aizawa never heard answered, and it had him mildly frustrated.
So, who heals you when you get injuries as severe as at USJ? When you've gotten to the point of collapse, who do you go to? I assume, based off your repeated methods of ignoring broken bones, that you have an unusual amount of history of working with them for your age.
He didn't like the way Midoriya shrugged at the question. His brain jerked up the images that had plagued his dreams the entire weekend. Medicated sleep made things so much more vivid. A lopsided stance on shivering, broken legs and a massive head dragging on the ground. The horrible gurgling of breathing past draining blood, the crunch of a skull. And it all felt like it had been too much to be survivable. He had thought he was watching his student die.
No one.
It was said in such a matter-of-fact way, like it was odd to even have been a question in the first place. As if the state he has been living in was his only reasonable option. He feels an old but familiar ache of empathy. He understood this mindset all too well.
Nobody mourns the loss of a monster in the stories of heroes. They're eventually beaten and bloodied or killed. The hero is celebrated and everybody moves on without concern. You see it all the time. It's just the state of nature in the social fantasy. This is just the way people view the culture of heroes and villains at large. It's just also my reality.
Izuku shrank in on himself a bit of non-verbal apology as he continued.
I've been running from heroes chasing me down almost my whole life.
The bell chimed for the first class of the day to start. They waited for the sound to end in heavy air.
Go on. If anyone asks why I pulled you out, tell them they can talk to me directly.
He lets the conversation drop there. Izuku stood hesitantly, apparently unsure about leaving the topic on what he probably felt was an attack on Aizawa's person.
I can talk to you later. I don't need your grades dropping because I kept you out of class on the first day back.
Aizawa urged.
Are you gonna be okay?
Midoriya asked as his hands fumbled around each other, picking, itching to do something.
I swear, I'm gonna...
Aizawa sighed.
Yes, I'm just gonna rest here a moment before I go back to the teacher's lounge.
That was apparently all it took as Midoriya rushed out of the room. The door closed as it really sank in that this kid had really spent pretty much his whole life trying his best to do good things for others and help everyone he could, even while struggling himself, and still thought of himself as a monster that deserved no ease. Midoriya's mind set himself as the villain of his own story, and had spent so much trying to redeem himself when he saw his own existence as irredeemable. It was familiar. It hurt. Aizawa deflated in the chair as much as his healing injuries would let him. A few doubts riled up in the back of his mind about the plan he had been slowly forming over the last 2 days, so he fumbled out his phone with his one usably bandaged hand. He wanted to check something before he actually tried any of it. They both owned different halves of the same duplex, effectively a whole house, and both had a spare room. He was most likely being majorly impulsive, which he writes away mentally as being uncharacteristic, even if he knew it wasn't entirely true. He just had to check first. It would undoubtedly be something that gets dragged around him for ages later, but that wasn't important. He opened the chat. Sho-chan.
I'm considering making a school-sanctioned intervention with a student.
E-chan. And this is about Midoriya, isn't it? You're really gonna adopt your class again while stubbornly denying it, except now it's gonna be in a literal sense. You said before all of this he was homeless anyway, so why are you messaging me? Not like I'm gonna have a fit over taking a kid out the streets and giving him a home. He growled softly, exhaustion settling heavily as he felt the teasing energy across the campus already. Yes, it bothered him from the start that Midoriya was homeless, but more than that was his isolation. Aizawa figured he had probably been alone for years, if the far less than ideal relationship he has seen with Bakugo was any indication. Showtime.
Blame me being a hero, if that's what it needs for you to not tease me about being soft. I don't want him on his own anymore if I can help it, especially after USJ.
Ichan, don't you think AM would have taken him in or something already if he wanted to be off the streets?
Shouchan, what, and hide that big of a secret from the paparazzi? Funny.
Ichan, and why not just find a place for him on campus? I thought you loathed the idea of the kids knowing where you hung out outside of class, let alone where you lived.
Shouchan, Hizashi.
Ichan, having a kid move in with us is gonna be a jump, dude.
Shouchan, Yamada Hizashi, do you want to help the kid or not?
Ichan, I mean, duh, I just didn't expect you to suddenly be so gung-ho about the whole thing out of nowhere.
Shouchan, there were developments. I want to control the fallout if I can.
Ichan, finger guns.
Yue held the legal right to act as a ward of a student in specific circumstances, a right Aizawa was willing to exercise and wield to take Midoriya in if the kid agreed. He wasn't going to force him into a home he doesn't feel comfortable accepting, as much as it would frustrate him to have to deal with that. He didn't want to admit to the tiny part of him still searching for information about this other form Midoriya has. Aizawa refused to call the form a monster and lend to his student's self-image. A reflection of warped mental ideas tended to act as involuntary validation, even if mentioned just for clarification. He stood and grumbled at the aching in his body, the level of which he was making repeated note of to ensure Midoriya wasn't trying to lead it away suddenly. The agreement of his partner in mind, he made his way towards the offices. Nezu should be there, and likely Yagi as well, carefully out of his All Might persona, so as to save his time. It would be best to talk to both about his plan to take in Midoriya after the conversation they had.